shoestring non-profit outfit based here in Manchester. We're aimed at providing a critical discourse on the left. And we have similar events to this running throughout the year, one of which is the event which I think we've left leaflets out on everybody's chairs, the Love, Sex and Alienation meeting, which will be on next November. Tonight we'll discuss the legacy of deindustrialisation and its impact on the strategies for socialism. We'll start with two 15-minute introductions from our panel, after which we'll throw the meeting out to the floor. Speakers, I'll tap on the glass when you have 5 minutes and 1 minute left consecutively of your introductions. And without further ado, I'll introduce our speakers. To my left we have Nick Srnicek, is that the correct one too? Yeah. Who's a fellow in globalisation and geopolitics at UCL. He's the author with Alex Williams of Inventing the Future, and the editor with Levi Bryan and Graham Harman of The Speculative Term. And to my right, we have Michael Roberts, who's worked in the City of London as an economist for over 30 years. He's author of The Great Recession, A Marxist View, published by Lulu in 2009. He has a forthcoming new book, The Long Depression, and blogs at thenextrecession.wordpress.com. So I'll kick off the meeting now with a first introduction from Michael, move over to Nick, and then we'll throw it out to the audience for more contributions.
Well, I won't use the mic. Can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, you want it for that, do you? Okay.
Yeah,
sorry about that. Technology at my age. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this meeting of spring. And I think it's important that we discuss the question of industrialisation and what that means for the globe, for the UK, still the UK, and for people in general, working class people in general. I'd like to start by referring to a Manchester citizen who 170 years ago, about your age, wrote a book called The Condition of the English Working Class, Frederick Engels. In that book, he described the industrialisation process at its height, taking place in Manchester at that time. He was working for his uncle as the manager of a factory, and the book goes into some detail about the terrible social and environmental conditions that working people had to put up with coming in from the countryside for the first time, to work very long hours, children as well of course, and to live in squalor, disease, in towns which weren't able to cope for them. That process of industrialisation under capitalism is what industrialisation has been like over the last 170 years in different countries. In 1892, Engels had his book republished, and he wrote a preface, and in there he said, and I think this is quite interesting, he says, back in the 1844, England was the only really fast-growing industrial power. Now, in 1892, there are other countries, France, Germany, and especially America, who are now competitors. They are reaching industrialisation. Their manufacturers as young as compared with those of England in 1844, but increasing at a far more rapid rate than the latter. We have now arrived at the same phase of development as English manufacturing was in 1844. So he was making the point that the process of industrialisation had moved on, that in a way the industrialisation of England had been completed by the 1890s. The process then became one, as we now know, that the industrial sector of the UK and England declined as a share of production and employment. Most people don't work in industry as we understand it, manufacturing, heavy industry, mining and so on, in England anymore. Increasingly, most people work in what is called services. Now, these definitions are rather ambiguous. And I'd just like to, the first point that I really want to make is, because we're talking about a subject of deindustrialisation, but actually, globally, deindustrialisation is not taking place. Industrialisation is still taking place, globally. I looked up the data from the International Labour Organization. There are 2.2 billion people in the world working, producing value, out of the 7 billion in 1991. Now, there are 3.2 billion people working on and off in order to make a living for the rest of the people that are dependent upon them. But the world is not industrialized because industry, people working in the industry, manufacturing, mining, other heavy industries, is increasing. It's not declining. Using figures provided by the ILO, the industrial workforce has actually increased in the last 20 years by 46%. There were 490 million people in 1991 who worked in industry in the world. There are now 715 million people working in industry. And by the end of this decade, there will be 800 million people working in industry, not in agriculture, not in services. The industrial workforce has been growing at nearly 2% a year and is actually accelerating. Of course, it's not accelerating in countries like the UK, the United States, Europe, Japan, the mature capitalist economies, but in those other economies around the rest of the world where a lot of industrial production has been invested in by the capitalists globally. In fact, of course, we know that in the mature economies, Europe, Japan, the United States, the industrial workforce has fallen. In 1991, it was 130 million out of that 490 million that worked in mature capitalist economies. Now it's only 107 million out of 715 million. So the shift of industrialization has gone from countries like England that Engels described in 1844, and from countries like France and Germany and the United States that he described in 1892, on to countries like China and India and elsewhere. Another fact I found was that capitalism is industrializing still. It's still the main process of capitalism, to industrialize, not to deindustrialize. And it's sucking more and more labour out of where? Out of agriculture. It's agriculture that is declining. If you want to talk about the phenomenon of the last 25 years, it's not deindustrialization globally, it's de-agricalization, if you like, or de-ruralization. Increasingly, the share of the workforce that used to be in agriculture has fallen dramatically by 1/3 in the last 20 years. More and more people are leaving the rural areas, leaving farming and going into the cities to deal with all the long hours, the squalor and the conditions that Engels described in 1844, wherever it now might be in Bombay, or should I say Mumbai. It might be in other various cities in China, in all parts of Asia and of course in Latin America. That is where industrialization is taking place, and the same phenomenon of people fighting for better conditions, facing the difficulties. We see that now in the issues raised by the Ebola crisis, which shows what happens when they don't have the health conditions in cities and the dangers that that leads to in disease. And that was the same thing in 1844 with cholera. Now we have a different problem facing people who are going into the cities to be industrialized. So although the industrial workforce in the developed capitalist economies has declined, as I said before, it's not the case globally. So one of the key factors in what we're finding here is that industrialization is the process of capitalism, and it's still going on. It has not been completed, and it still has, in the 21st century, some way to go. Capitalism is still searching for the exploitation of labour from the agricultural and rural areas, bringing them into the cities, and raising the urbanisation and industrialisation process. But of course it is the case in the OECD, as they call it, or the advanced capitalist countries, that employment in industry and manufacturing is in decline, as I've said before. In the US, for example, we've seen a very sharp decline, something like 1/3 of the fall since the mid-80s to now in people employed in manufacturing. It's a very sharp fall. And so the process of deindustrialization, or people moving out of manufacturing jobs, has declined. Although I would make one caveat here, that there is when we look at the data, they often say, well, the services sector, that's where everybody works now. They don't work in big industry, they don't work in factories, they don't work in manufacturing plants anymore. This is true, or less so. It's still the case that 15 to 20% do, who are working. But those who are working in services aren't necessarily what we think of services. The old measure of services was shops, small businesses and so on, which were providing basic services, cleaning and all the rest of it, that sort of thing. But there's also a whole range of people who are really industrial workers, whether they're working in communications, in transport, in the high-tech industries. These aren't necessarily included in manufacturing because software development isn't included in manufacturing. All those sort of industries really are industrial workers. It's still the case. So another point to make is There may be deindustrialization taking place as we understand it, but the working class is not disappearing. There is still the majority of people have to work for a living, as we know. But even within those that have to work for a living and can't live off income from dividends or stocks or so on, which is, if you like, the definition of the owners of capital, the capitalist class, even those who have to work for a living, there's still a very sizable section, even in the advanced capitalist countries, that really work in what we would call industries now, that are not a question of providing a service like cleaning, like shopkeeping and so on. They also provide new products which have to be sold on the market. There are two other points I want to make about deindustrialization. Yes, deindustrialization is taking place, industry is declined. Why? Why has industry declined as a share of the workforce? What is going on in modern economies, and what can we understand from that? In my view, we can't talk about modern economies without saying capitalist economies. They are not some amorphous term. This is a capitalist economy. What does that mean? That means that production only takes place if the companies who own the capital, own the means of production, whether it's an office, whether it's a factory, employing the workers, and the workers don't own that, they will only do that if they get a profit. We have a profit-making system. Money is to make money. Things are not produced unless they make money, and more money than was originally invested. If they don't, it will stop. We don't produce things for people, we don't produce things for need, we produce things for profit. That's the way the system works, and it's profit for the people who own the capital. They compete against each other, and they exploit the workers to compete against each other. In competing against each other, they have to try and get a greater market share, they have to get more profit, otherwise they'll be driven out of the market. So one of the main ways of getting higher profit is to try and introduce new technology, new and more efficient and productive ways. They can make workers work harder, they can make them work longer, they can time and motion them, but there's limits to that. The best way for reducing costs and being able to have an advantage over your competitor as an owner of capital is to have a new technology which reduces the cost of labour, increases the productivity of labour for every unit of production. So the process going on here is actually a process of shedding labour. What happens under capitalism with industrialisation is deindustrialisation. That in accumulating more capital, in competing with each other, they start to shed labour. By shedding labour, they reduce the ability, contradictory, to produce more value eventually, because an essence of understanding the process of capitalism is that profit only comes from workers' work. That's the only way you get any profit. Workers don't work, you get no profit. If there are less workers working, you'll get less profit. You can get more out of each worker, but the contradiction arrives between how much you get out of each worker and then having less. There's a labour shedding process going on, which actually produces a contradiction in capitalism. How has that capitalist solved that contradiction in the mature economies? They realise that their profitability is beginning to decline over time, and in the late 19th century particularly, they began to expand their operations outside of the mature economies into the rest of the world. Globalisation began from the late 19th century, and it particularly continued in the late 20th century. A massive expansion of capital to set up factories and suck in all that labour from the rural areas in China, in India, in Asia, and Latin America. This process of sucking up labour, of globalisation, is why deindustrialisation is taking place in the West, if you want to call it that, and it's moved to the emerging economies, emerging capitalist economies in the East and the South over the past, particularly the last 30 years. So we have two things here. We have inevitable process of shedding labour as part of industrialisation to make a profit, that's why. And secondly, by shedding labour and profitability starts to decline, so you need to expand that. So capitalism has to keep expanding out into the world, sucking up more and more labour, cheap labour, and industrialising it and trying to use that. But of course there will be a limit to that. If that process reaches the limit, we run out of workers that you can take off the land, then you're in a position where you have a serious contradiction between the profitability of your investment and the amount of labour available to create more. I'll finish on this point, Chairman. One of the new phenomena of the 21st century is going to be robots. What we're now moving towards, if you in the process of labour shedding, is that capitalists are now moving toward of shedding labour completely. That we have robots making robots that produce everything. Everybody in this room could be replaced by a robot in the next 25 years. I won't be here to find out. But that is an indication of the process that is beginning to take place. Even what are so-called middle-class jobs, white-collar jobs, are going to be replaced. Even economists are going to be replaced, like myself. Apparently, we already have a hedge fund in the United States which has on its board an algorithm. It isn't a person, it's an algorithm. The algorithm tells the hedge fund board members whether they should buy or sell. They don't need a person anymore. This process is going to continue at an accelerating rate. We have to ask the question, what does this mean for us working class people, people in general? Are we to be replaced by robots? Will this mean a leisure society where everybody works 2 hours a week and takes the money from the robots? Or will we end up with a highly exploitive, unequal society, even more than it is now? We know that the latest figures that showed by the Credit Suisse UN report is that the top 1% of wealth holders in the world own nearly half of all the personal wealth. Just 1%. The top 10% of wealth holders in the world own 87% of all the personal wealth. 50% of the world's people own nothing. They have no wealth, really, to speak of. So there's a huge inequality already. This process of robots that we're going to see now can either increase that inequality to the point of explosion, or it will create a leisure society. I'll leave the question open for us to discuss which way it's going to go.
Thank you very much. I'll quickly pass over to Nick, but just before you start speaking, if there's still people standing who can't see very well, there is some room down this side of the room, down near where Faisal's standing over here. Faisal, give everyone a wave. There we go, down. Thank you. Nick Srnicek.
Thank you. So I just want to say thank you to Charlie for inviting me, and everybody for coming as well. I think that's a really good sort of, my talk will follow up quite nicely, I think, on Michael's talk. In terms of some of our data is quite different. We draw different conclusions from it. But actually I think we're led to the same sort of final conclusion about a leisure society or a sort of rapid intensification of inequality, exploitation, and surplus populations. So the argument I want to make today is a bit speculative, so I'm quite open to debating it afterwards. But I want to argue that only deindustrialization can lead us beyond capitalism. Or in other words, that any sort of post-capitalism that we want or that we can have will necessarily be post-industrial as well. So essentially this means that rather than bemoan the loss of manufacturing jobs or struggle to sort of lure them back to the UK, to the US, any of the advanced capitalist countries, we should actually look at deindustrialization as an important and irreversible achievement, as something that we shouldn't decry. So historically speaking, I think it's actually akin to the move away from agriculture-based economies, something which Michael picked up on as well. So just as the mechanization of agriculture freed people from reliance upon, from working on the land, the deindustrialization process has the potential, at least, to free people from the drudgery of most productive work. So the claim that deindustrialization is necessary for post-capitalism means reimagining what the transition between economies is like. Now the traditional story of moving beyond capitalism is fairly straightforward. I imagine a number of us here know it, but I'll sort of go through it anyways. And the story has of course been complicated and critiqued throughout the 20th century, but I still think it sort of forms the general framework. And this is a sort of widespread assumption for a lot of thinking about what a post-capitalist society might look like. So in this traditional image of transition, you start with a shift away from agriculture-based economies, built around a large peasantry, which has some means of production in order to survive off its own land. Now in its place, there's sort of, instead of an agriculture-based economy, you have rapid industrialization, exemplified by the textile industry, the steel industry, and eventually the automobile industry in the 20th century. Now the social effects of this were particularly important for understanding how post-capitalism was supposed to come about. And I'll just mention here, I use the term post-capitalism rather than socialism or communism, just because those latter two terms are sort of laden with a lot of historical resonances that I don't think we necessarily want to tie ourselves to. I think post-capitalism is a much more generic term. It leaves open the question of exactly what is beyond capitalism. So the story about how we were supposed to get to post-capitalism. There was a move from rural populations to an increase in urban populations. And there was a transformation simultaneously of the peasantry into the proletariat. This involved, of course, primitive accumulation and the dispossession of common land amongst people. Now, this effectively created a new urban working class who had only their labor power to sell. Now, the sort of side effect of this was the emergence of a strong working class in the late 19th century and the early 20th century in particular. So factories, for instance, meant that workers were increasingly centralized in the same space, and the tendencies of capitalism were supposed to increasingly homogenize this group of people. So everybody was supposed to become proletariats, everybody was supposed to become increasingly in the same sort of situation. Now the result of all of this was that the working class came to share the same material interests. So they would struggle for things like better working conditions, higher wages, shorter working weeks, these sorts of things. Now, so in other words, with industrialization, there was the basis for a strong working class identity. Now it's important to note here that the industrial working class was actually always a minority in terms of the working population. So I found some figures in terms of the height of manufacturing in even the most industrialized countries, which were the UK and Germany. Employment in manufacturing at its height only involved 45% of the population. So it's a massive amount of the population, but still a minority of the population. It never quite reached the levels of, say, agriculture. Now, on the basis of their political strength, the working class was supposed to become the vanguard of the population, leading us away from capitalism and towards something better. And with the growing power of the working class and the socialization of production, it was thought that workers could simply take over the means of production and run it democratically and for the greater good, for society rather than for profit. Now, of course, we know this didn't happen. And the best example we have of an attempt at this is the Soviet experience, the sort of miserable Soviet experience. And what occurred there in that experiment was a glorification of productivity at the expense of freedom. So just as in capitalist societies, work was the ultimate imperative, and productivity in particular. So it's no surprise then that when you look at the Soviet experience, you see Taylorism, you see Fordism, and you see all of these productivity-enhancing techniques being forced upon the workers of the USSR. So it didn't work in the USSR, and in the capitalist countries what we saw was that the industrial sectors declined, and the basis for a strong working class has been systematically attacked, particularly since the 1970s. Now, importantly, and this is where I think some of our data diverges, is that even developing countries are increasingly deindustrialized. And I think this can be seen in two broad facts. So the first aspect is that newly industrializing economies are not industrializing to the same degree as past economies. Now, this is measured in terms of manufacturing employment as a percentage of the population. So whereas beforehand the first industrialized economies would reach 30 to 40% employment in manufacturing, today it's closer to 15 to 20% in places like China, India, and Brazil. So they're not industrializing to the same degree, even if they are industrializing. And secondly, these economies are reaching their a point of deindustrialization at a quicker pace. So they sort of reach a peak level of manufacturing employment at a much more rapid pace. And this is measured in terms of per capita income levels. So these countries, when they start deindustrializing, they're much poorer than when the UK, the US, Germany, France, and all of these countries did. So essentially, they're deindustrializing at a much earlier period than previous countries did. So this is the so-called problem, if you look at the literature, it's a problem called premature deindustrialization. There's a number of knock-on effects of premature industrialization, which I won't talk about here, but it's quite interesting. I think the end result, though, of the experience of the 20th century, when we reflect back on it, is that the promise of the traditional narrative, this idea that the working class would struggle and gain democratic control over the means of production, has not been fulfilled, and actually now seems to be obsolete. We no longer live in an industrial world, and classic images of the transition to post-capitalism need to be updated. So I want to put forth here a sort of alternative, an alternative based upon deindustrialization as a basic premise. So can we still imagine a transition to something beyond capitalism, or have the very conditions of post-capitalism evaporated into history? What does the transcendence of capitalism mean, if not simply working class control over the means of production? And I want to take my cue here of what post-capitalism might mean from a quote of Marx's. So Marx, famously doesn't really talk about communism, what it might mean in many places, but in the third volume of Capital, he does a sort of extensive discussion, which to me at least is a discussion of communism for him. Now he says, just a short quote from him here, he says, "In fact, the realm of freedom actually begins only where labor which is determined by necessity and mundane considerations ceases. Thus, in the very nature of things, it lies beyond the sphere of actual material production." So I think what is invoked here by Marx is that the realm of freedom, the realm of post-capitalism, is beyond both material production and the centrality of work to society. So deindustrialization, insofar as it means the replacement of human labor with increasingly mechanized and automated labor, is therefore a necessary step to something beyond capitalism. So deindustrialization is essentially the only way in which we escape the imposition of work upon humans. It enables us to outsource production and labor to machines rather than to us. And importantly, I think deindustrialization appears to be the only way to achieve a society of abundance and leisure time at the same time. So without it, I think we sort of fall into two possible alternatives, neither of which are very enjoyable. So the first alternative is that we could have expanded free time, but with a generalized poverty as well. It's a sort of a primitive communism idea. We don't have to work, but we don't have much much wealth either. The sort of second alternative is an increasing abundance. So we have plenty of things, we have lots of wealth, but it's at the cost of authoritarian work. And I think this is broadly what Soviet communism was attempting to do. Now I think if we want to avoid these outcomes, the automation of manufacturing and productive work in general is a necessary step to building something beyond capitalism. So deindustrialization is, in other words, a necessary stage to move beyond capitalism. And if we change our understanding of how to get to socialism, we end up having to revise a few common assumptions as well. So I want to briefly conclude with a few consequences of this different perspective on deindustrialization. Now in the first place, as I mentioned at the start, we should accept that manufacturing is gone, and this is actually a good thing. We shouldn't be striving to bring it back, unless it's going to be fully automated, which is this phenomenon of reshoring, which is actually occurring now, where labor costs are going up in China, so people are reshoring, but with fully automated factories in the US. That's not a bad thing. If we're going to have manufacturing, it should be automated. But secondly, we need a cultural shift which displaces the priority given to work. So jobs and work can't be central to our society, and they can't be central to our identities. And I think we can see the effects of this belief everywhere. It's quite easy to see. So the demonization of the unemployed and the poor, the fact that you're sort of a lesser being if you don't have a job, if you're struggling for work. The mainstream solution to this problem being just get jobs for everyone. You see this in the Labour Party, you see this in trade unions, the idea that we need to have jobs for everybody, and this is the only solution to things. This is the glorification in the Tory Party, but also in Labour as well, of hard-working families. So very much work being placed at the center of political discourse. So I think everywhere we look, work is the dominant demand of our societies. But the ultimate aim here needs to be a delinking of wages from work. So of course, we're all proletariats, we all need to struggle, we all need to work in order to survive. What we need to do is separate those wages, that necessity for survival, from the imperative to work. And I think human societies are rapidly reaching the point where there simply isn't enough work to go around, even if it was a sort of morally virtuous goal to have everybody work. Which I don't think it is, but even if you grant that assumption. So there's effectively a rising surplus population. So you can see this in the unemployed, but particularly the underemployed, which continues to remain at quite high levels across developed economies. You see this in precarious work everywhere. And you see it in the absolute surplus, which is indexed by things like the rise in global slums, over 1 billion people living in global slums, but also mass incarceration in places like America. It's a surplus population that just has no productive use in capitalism, and is effectively just tossed to the side of society.